welcome back to Paris Lesbos. We did Garbo last month, so according to the unspoken rules of old Hollywood, we're doing Marlene Dietrich this month.
Just hitting all of the big members of our group here.
Not all of them. There's still quite a few who haven't come on yet for their spotlight.
Yeah, but we got some pretty big names right here. I mean, Garbo, Dietrich, ooh.
Like many of the women of our podcast's world, Dietrich occasionally tweaked dates, facts, and in her case persuaded the copyright holders of films prior to her appearance in Blue Angel to suppress the footage of her in those films.
Wow, so she has a lot of control of her image.
She also suppressed the existence of her sister, but we've got to start at the beginning. Born in 1901 in the city of Schöneberg, and under the name Marie Magdalena, Dietrich was the second daughter of a soldier-turned-police lieutenant. Her original name didn't last long. She soon combined her first and middle names to create Marlene. She also was genetically blessed with a symmetrical face, the rare quality where you look good from all angles no matter if there's even a hurricane rolling in.
Great way of putting it.
Now, you'd think having an imperial cop for a dad would provide a stable middle-class life. It didn't. He apparently chafed at the role, and the family moved house almost every year after Dietrich was born. By the fifth house, her mother is suddenly listing herself as a widow in the Berlin telephone book.
Now, is she listing herself as a widow because she wants to be rid of him, or is he actually dead?
The story goes that her father died from falling off a horse, but her parents had separated the year before. However, it does still appear that he did die, somehow.
All right.
Now, a police widow's pension didn't go far, so her mother basically became a glorified housekeeper to a wealthy family when Marlene started school in 1907. As time progressed, people started to notice that Dietrich was very good with a violin, to the point her mother bought her one.
That is not the direction I thought we'd go in.
Music turned into a deep joy, but at school she was considered shy and sat in the back row until she developed a crush on the French teacher, Mademoiselle Bregonde. This was followed by a crush on Henny Porten, Germany's first real film star and everybody's crush. Like she was called the German Mary Pickford, so think teens putting photos on the inside of their lockers.
Oh.
Now, Marlene took it a bit further. Where most people meeting Porten on the street just said hello and walked off, Dietrich hid behind kiosks and whatnot near her house before mustering up the courage to go knock on the door one day with her violin and the plan to play Porten's favorite song. She did. Porten was gracious. The second time was more strained.
The second time?
A third involved a ladder up to a window and a shutter slammed in Dietrich's face.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're getting a bit creepy here. If we hadn't been before.
Dietrich wasn't distraught. After all, it was a star who slammed the shutter in her face.
I mean, I guess.
What goes through the minds of teenagers?
That's a good point. I mean, we were all very stupid when we were teenagers, so, you know.
And then World War I arrived. The 12-year-old Marlene was not caught up in the patriotism of the fall of 1914 and pronouncements of troops home by Christmas. She was too busy grieving the departure of the French teacher who could no longer stay at the school with France and Germany at war. Then Dietrich and her mother and sister moved from Berlin to the countryside with her mom's employer's family. At first, battlefield victories were celebrated with school holidays. Soon, though, studies were partially postponed for the children to knit socks and gloves for the soldiers at the front. Classes akin to the modern home economics were thrown aside in favor of ever more inventive methods of preserving potatoes and then turnips when they ran out of potatoes.
That sounds pretty grim.
This was partially due to both helping soldiers at the front and for themselves, as Germany was blockaded during World War I. Civilians suffered a food shortage for much of the war that stunted children's growth and caused outbreaks of disease and death, as noted by diplomats and medical professionals still within the nation. In fact, it's thought that staples like potatoes were practically gone by the end of 1916, and people lived on sawdust-filled bread and powdered milk.
Delicious.
It is also possible during this time that Dietrich had a crush who went off to war after her first kiss, and then he died on some battlefield, but the story is unclear.
And you had said that she had control over a lot of the narrative of her life, so I don't know, this sounds pretty romantic. Not that it didn't happen, but, you know.
And speaking of soldiers, the more clear addition to her life was her stepfather, Eduard von Losch, a grenadier wounded on the Eastern Front, whom Marlene's 40-year-old mother married in late 1916 or 1917 at his bedside in a war hospital. He died in a week from his wounds, and his body was delivered to his mother in Dessau for burial. On the upside for Marlene, her mother now had a death pension from this second quick marriage.
How convenient.
After that, the family moved back to Berlin in 1917. By now, Marlene was more self-confident. She now sat in the front row rather than the back. Other girls gossiped about her using bedroom eyes, quotations around here, on the few male teachers who'd escaped conscription. She also performed with her violin in Red Cross pageants, sometimes in male costumes.
Ooh.
However, while she applied herself more at school, she didn't graduate. Dietrich decided to pursue music rather than academics, unlike her obedient and conventional sister who would become a teacher. She turned 17 shortly after the armistice was signed in 1918, and the monarchy was soon overthrown with the Weimar Republic created in its place. Marlene moved out to pursue her music studies. Initially, she lived in a boarding house in a room with 5 other girls, but she was still rebellious. She went off to lessons in chiffon so transparent that gossip said she was easy to get on her back. She also fell in with a bohemian crowd and eventually got a job playing the violin at the movie theater. For those of you who weren't aware, silent films were not truly silent. They did in fact have music in the form of musicians paid to score the scenes in real time.
Imagine the energy you'd have to put into it to give a silent movie something to go on, right? I don't know if anyone has seen silent films.
Well, of the silent films you can find online, they all tend to have music put to them. Obviously, it's not today an orchestra, it's just a sound recording.
But you really gotta have something, because otherwise it is boring as anything. I'm sorry. Have you seen silent movies? Like, okay, there's some really good stuff, historical, technological innovations, great. But they don't know how to pace things. And, like, music does so much for our appreciation of a movie, for understanding what the cues are for different emotional things. Like, music is so important.
There are many directors and acting coaches from the 1920s who would like a word with you.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, guys. You guys are wrong.
Side note, Dietrich was the only woman in this orchestra at the job. As a plus, being forced to watch a film over and over again makes you learn about films and acting. Unfortunately, she was fired after 4 weeks despite her boss praising her skill with the violin, because others complained that her legs were distracting.
Come on, guys.
In response, she took voice lessons and debuted in a cabaret. She also became a chorus girl, enjoyed drag balls, and later did boxing for a while, which was a shock to the gender roles of the time.
I love how she said, Oh, are my legs distracting? Let me find every possible outlet for distracting people with my legs.
She would go on to do the same with her films, as many people who shared the set with her would note.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I can imagine.
And then she may have gotten married.
How does one possibly get married and not definitely? Don't we have records?
Okay, so starting from the beginning here. One biographer has suggested that she married an Otto Katz, a Soviet-trained spy who also went under the name Rudolf Breda at one point. He was apparently a poet, the son of Jewish textile business people, and a literal card-carrying member of the Communist Party. And if I'm laughing at this point, it's because it sounds kind of ludicrous the way the biographer wrote this theory, but there's a reason I always say history is the literal embodiment of the phrase, I can't make this up. The strangest things turn out to be true, like women accused of setting off bombs in flower pots in Parisian cafes while they're 100 miles away on their deathbeds. But that's a different episode. Back to Marlene and Otto. If they did marry, it would have been circa 1922, I think. Either way, it didn't last long, and her film career started when she played a maid in a 1923 film about Napoleon's brother Jerome.
I love how our recurring theme here, low-key, is dramatic productions about Napoleon's relatives.
I don't think we've had any about his wife, though.
Yet.
Either way, soon after, at 21, Dietrich met Rudolf Sieber, by all accounts a ladies' man like Otto Katz, and a guy involved in the casting side of films.
Oh, that's handy.
They married in 1923, causing her mother to give her the cold shoulder for a time.
Was this because it was bigamy? Or, again, we don't have the records, I guess, right? So we don't know if she'd already been married?
No one knows if bigamy, because churches and their records were destroyed in World War II. We do know of a story that goes that the U.S. attorneys in the 1930s were arguing with the IRS and France over her income being taxed by France, because Rudy got French citizenship in the 30s at some point, and these attorneys and other people were just denied any documentation of her marriage.
And I guess the other thing is with her first husband being Jewish and, you know, the way that Germany was dealing with Jewish people and avoiding the potentiality for them to exist. I don't know. There's a ton of reasons why the documentation would be weird. If she indeed even had a first husband.
Yeah, it gets weirder.
Oh?
So a biographer suggested that Katz introduced Marlene to Rudy, and there's a theory that they might have been brothers because they were both Czech. The FBI had Rudolph's brother's name redacted in their files, and no other mention of a brother that the biographer could find exists. There's the odd enthusiasm for Catholicism that is usually found in converts rather than born Catholics, and the fact that Rudy and Dietrich's daughter left his surname off of his tombstone. In addition to the fact that Rudy's middle name was the first name of one of Katz's brothers in a bunch of records.
Interesting.
Either way, they had a daughter, Maria, in December 1924, and Marlene didn't say at various times throughout her life who the father was, Katz, Rudy, or someone else. And by then, Dietrich had also made the acquaintance of Sauke Vertel in Max Reinhardt's troupe, as they both appeared in a production of the Amazon Queen Penthesilea. Vertel would soon after promise not to mention Dietrich for the rest of her life, and this might be where the idea of Sauke knowing Dietrich and possibly her dirty laundry, like Otto Katz, was the reason that Dietrich and Garbo stayed away from each other in Hollywood, just as Garbo wanted at the time.
Interesting. So possibly explains that mystery, or maybe not.
Who knows? Maybe one biographer just had a fever dream. I have no idea.
I mean, hey, you've read biographies of famous people now. You've read so many. There's some times where biographers just have fun, right?
I feel like it's less have fun and more go down a rabbit hole and get really excited that they might have found something that other people didn't.
Mm-hmm.
But speaking of Garbo, we now come to the time of filming The Joyless Street by director Pabst, which stars Greta Garbo. As mentioned in the previous episode, Dietrich is said to have an uncredited part that involved Garbo fainting backwards into her arms, while Dietrich later murdered the butcher, a sequence that was cut but that she referenced to people later in life. It's said the two actresses had an affair that ended badly, possibly with Dietrich making fun of Garbo to her friends. After Garbo left for the States to join MGM, Dietrich was noticed by a producer's assistant while she was out nightclubbing, but she was rejected for being too attractive and vivacious.
Oh no, heaven forbid a star be that.
Basically, she wasn't taken seriously.
So it's this classic thing of women who present one way can't possibly act another way. As we all know, women are Barbies.
3 months later, she got work as the second female lead as a Parisian courtesan in Manon Lescaut, a romantic film set in 18th century France and Louisiana. Her career wasn't smooth sailing after that. There were still rejections for roles. She did get a few over the years, and in the meantime continued performing in cabarets with songs like My Best Girlfriend. You have probably come across it on YouTube as Meine beste Freundin. And the song became a hit, but she didn't get the role of Lulu in Pandora's Box when she was 26. That role went to the 21-year-old wild child from Hollywood, Louise Brooks. Pabst, the director, said Dietrich was too obvious for the role, and one look from her would turn the film into a burlesque. Basically, she couldn't play innocent as well for several scenes as Brooks could.
So they don't believe she can act.
Or that there's limits. Now, her breakthrough came in 1929 with the talkie Blue Angel, both in English and German. Her role as Lola was a sort of response to Brooks' Lulu. Lola was not a flapper or vamp, but she did perform in bars and turn tricks on the side. She was presented as unsentimental and lacking in remorse for the men who fell by the wayside or died in the film. Unlike Lulu, who unknowingly picks up Jack the Ripper at the end of Pandora's Box when she turns to prostitution.
She has a lot more power, does Lola.
And maybe some more self-awareness.
Oh, yeah.
Or just awareness.
Yeah, I don't know. It's actually, now that I think about it, it's she has a cunning to her. She knows what she wants and she gets it.
For the film, Marlene sang all of her own songs in both German and English. No one had to dub her at any point.
And I should point out, I don't know if you want to say it later, but the whole movie was not like dubbed. It was fully shot in English and in German. I think German in the mornings and English in the afternoons or something like that. So, which even today is not a thing that people do. I don't know why they decided to do that.
You can see then how this contributed to expenses, because at one point the production was in jeopardy. The equipment for sound and several cameras skyrocketed the cost of production, which ran 2 weeks over the timeline and during the time of the stock market crash.
Oof. So yeah, not great timing.
Especially not for experimental things like shoot in 2 different languages in one day.
Yeah. And should I note also, changing things up a bit too, because for the perceived American audience of the English, they took out some of the black extras that had been there in the German version.
To be honest, I was expecting you to say they removed some of the more explicit or suggestive scenes.
You know, they might have, but it gets pretty racy in there.
At the time, it made the record for most expensive sound film. Not that it would hold that for more than a few years, as Hollywood embraced sound for all of its stars. A few days after the film was sent to Paramount offices in the US, a phone call came clamoring for Dietrich to hop across the ocean. However, it was not a sure deal for her, as there was not yet a theatrical release of the film in the States. Maybe the American public would hate her, and then she'd have moved for nothing. There was also the possibility that the German UFA production company would try to tie her up for their future productions. Blue Angel was their film, after all. As it turns out, the film was shocking and a huge success. Soon after, Dietrich sailed for Hollywood. At 28, she landed in New York in April 1930. While there was a bit of a wait for roles, Marlene didn't have to wait as long as Garbo did, when MGM brought the Swedish actress over. Paramount also threw her into work immediately. While Paramount on Parade was already a fully formed film, they inserted a scene of Dietrich singing at the beginning. She would then send still shots of the initial idea, namely her in a suit, to friends in Berlin and sign them Daddy Marlene to make her lesbian friends laugh.
I love this so much.
Sternberg, her director, was not amused.
That's his problem.
Dietrich was to become glamorous, like Garbo had been made over before her. She was put through English language training to remove all traces of a German accent and run through losing weight and makeup experimentation to figure out how to make her look best on camera.
Can I just say, they did not remove all traces of a German accent, but that's one of the things we love about her.
And after all of this, Dietrich was swept into the production of Morocco. You've probably seen the scene of her singing in a nightclub while wearing a tuxedo, kissing a woman, and starting to seduce a soldier of the French Foreign Legion. If not, it's on YouTube. Look it up and fall in love. The film truly made her famous. Naturally, this led to curiosity and speculation about her sexuality among the public.
I don't know, it seems pretty clear to me.
Well, it was to other people as well, because women in Hollywood started propositioning her in bathrooms frequently, which she hated.
Oh no! She's like, find somewhere more romantic.
Can a woman pee in peace?
Right.
In response to the public's curiosity, not to the women's propositioning, Paramount's PR would release tidbits and photos about how Marlene missed her daughter. They leaned into the popular image of what a mother should be, in contrast to the characters she played on screen.
Because as we all know, people become mothers completely asexually.
On the other hand, they did not talk about her escorting another actress to a party while dressed in dark chiffon and a black velvet wrap. They were also alarmed to realize that her contract was only for 2 films and that she had a return ticket to Europe already. So they offered her a new contract for 2 films a year at triple her salary.
I'm getting mixed messages.
It's Hollywood. There's always going to be mixed messages between the PR and what the people are actually doing. After her next film, Dietrich did return to Berlin, where she was greeted with a party. When asked how she liked all the fuss, she mentioned how hard she had it early on in Berlin, and that she was still grateful for her new success. But she paused and said it came too late. Still, she returned to Hollywood. This was perhaps for the best, as Berlin was changing. The old theater actors muttered disdainfully about Dietrich being a Hollywood star coming to slum it. Not to mention a new political party gaining traction and demanding that the film Blue Angel be banned from all German theaters. The world would later know them as Nazis. Meanwhile, her husband had a mistress, though he played a doting father to Dietrich's daughter, Maria. She didn't divorce him, either.
I mean, it doesn't seem like she was particularly faithful while she was in America.
No, and she was fine with the setup. It almost sounds like they were good friends and occasional roommates after the spark, if it existed, fizzled. She did decide, though, that Maria should come with her to America. Meanwhile, supported financially by Dietrich, Rudy and his mistress went to France both for work and to get away from any nosy reporters. Remember, Paramount was leaning into her image as a mother.
Yeah, so there's gotta be a lot of subterfuge there.
One of Dietrich's next films was Shanghai Express in 1932 with Anna May Wong. whom she had met once back in Berlin. She again plays a courtesan who turns out to be an ex-girlfriend of the main character. Wong played another courtesan and friend of Dietrich's character. You can see Marlene is starting to be typecast here. She didn't like it, so she threatened to go back to Europe again, which is how she got changed to a mother-wife character in Blonde Venus, her next film, though there's still cabaret singing and prostitution due to poverty in it before she marries a different man at the end of the film. It didn't do as well at the box office. In fact, in the early 1930s, Paramount went bankrupt. The Paramount we know today rose out of its ashes, but its full name is longer so that they could keep Paramount in the title. Marlene did stay in Hollywood during and after this, because she recognized how bad things were getting in Berlin. Though Sternberg was one of her favorite directors, she knew that there was no way she could return and make a film with a Vienna-born Jew for the UFA. You see...
Yeah, things had started to change by that time, hadn't they?
Yeah, by 1933, the now-ruling Nazi Party began revoking citizenship from several artists and directors whom Marlene knew.
And this wasn't just for Jewish descent, right? There was also this thing about deviance and creating morally repulsive media and whatnot.
Oh yeah, suspected communists and so forth. There's a funny story about one German actor who was in France. He got the news that his citizenship had been revoked, and he, who had been a Catholic all his life, immediately went and converted to Judaism as a giant fuck you.
Wow! Well, there you go.
So now everyone in Hollywood needed to get a new contract in order to not be deported. On a happier note, Dietrich met Mercedes D'Acosta at a dance concert one night when D'Acosta and Cecil Beaton sat behind her during the show. They chatted during intermission. The next day, clad in slacks, she showed up at Mercedes' house with a bunch of white roses. As Mercedes wrote later, Marlene hesitated at the doorway and looked at me in the same shy way as the evening before. I asked her to come into the room and put out my hand. She took it in an almost military manner, bent over it, and explained, "I hope you will forgive me. I noticed you last night in the theater and wanted to meet you. I know very few people in Hollywood, and no one who could introduce us, so I just found out where you live, and I came myself." Mercedes found this charming and informal, and wanted to talk about movies. "Oh, let's not talk about pictures," Marlene said. "I would like to tell you something if you won't think I am mad. You seem too thin and your face so white that it seems to me you are not well. Last evening when I looked at you, I felt you were very sad." Side note, Garbo was out of town and the two were in their on-again, off-again affair. But back to what Marlene said. "I am sad too. I am sad and lonely. You are the first person here to whom I have felt drawn. Unconventional as it may seem, I came to see you because I just could not help myself."
And we assume this went a bit better than the last time she knocked on a famous person's door.
Is Mercedes really famous?
No, that's a good question. And kind of a mean one, but yeah.
But after saying all that, we can see the beginning of Dietrich playing Hausfrau and feeding the starving writer, who is not actually starving. She has quite a bit of money, but we normally are starving.
Right, in her soul, maybe.
I was going to think in the wage department.
Oh, well, you know.
The two then lived for a time in a rented Santa Monica beach house. There was still a trip to Europe with Marlene's daughter to visit her separated husband in France, but she was jeered at the train station and there were rumors the Parisian police would arrest her for wearing men's clothes. The arrest didn't happen. Instead, Dietrich hung out with old friends in exile, including her ex-girlfriend Margot Lyon, and hunted for sheet music and new songs, which she then recorded. After, she returned to Hollywood and filming with Sternberg, who'd garnered a new contract. By this point, the Nazis had issued an edict that effectively banned and exiled any German actors and directors who were abroad. At this point, she actually still retained her German citizenship because she was not Jewish. You see, there were some high-up Nazi officers who were fans.
Oh, it's so arbitrary.
By the mid-1930s, the affair with Mercedes ended. but Dietrich soon took up with actor John Gilbert. There's a pattern here, and I'm not referring to the fact that people ping-ponged from Garbo to Dietrich. No, it's the fact Dietrich tended to somewhat turn into housefrau during her affairs. Gilbert was drinking way too much when they met, as he despaired over the deterioration of his career and felt like a failure at everything. Career, 4 marriages, and fatherhood. Marlene dragged him out dancing and to dinner, kept alcohol away from him, tanned him beside her pool, did his Christmas shopping, and even wrapped presents for his daughter. She also tried to get him a film role to show he could talk well enough for the new age of film and still act well. This sounds a lot like the trope of I can fix them.
Boy, does it.
This is very different from the whispered end of the affair with Garbo, but maybe maturity?
Maybe she has become more mature in the interim. Yeah, who knows?
She also later made comments comparing Garbo to a peasant. But the affair with Gilbert and his starting a comeback ended as Marlene started a short-lived affair with Gary Cooper, and Gilbert didn't see the point to going on without her. So he died an alcoholic not long after the start of 1936.
Ouch. It was not a good time.
Marlene's daughter's friendship with Gilbert's daughter was also disrupted by this, but as one later lover noted, Dietrich was probably the most self-centered woman I ever met in my life. She was absolutely fascinated by herself and by her photographs.
So she wasn't too bothered?
By wrecking her daughter's friendships to an extent? No. About a year or two later, Marlene did send her daughter to France, where Rudy enrolled her in a private all-girls school in Lausanne. Maria was probably relieved to be away from her mother, causing embarrassment for her, with cultural faux pas like telling a film crew to ignore my daughter's moods as she is 11 and has menstruation. A statement that was apparently fine in Berlin, but mortifying in California.
Hey, I would love if it were fine in California, but I can picture being that girl and I would not be pleased.
This did not help Maria's reputation on set, because naturally she withdrew in embarrassment from everyone, including the other girl who was playing a second convent girl alongside her in some film, who would then interpret her as being snooty and acting like Dietrich's daughter, meaning aloof. By 1937, Germany recognized her fame and the influence it could bring. So, the UFA was dispatched to Dietrich with a script in hand and promises of everything she could possibly want, plus undisputed queendom of the German film industry. Of course, all that came with the Nazis attached on a string. She said she'd never return. To further solidify this, she became an American citizen and renounced her German citizenship before the start of World War II.
This is, I should note, part of what is known as Hitler's gift to America.
And speaking of that war, Marlene still appeared in films between 1939 and 1945, but her more memorable activities included sending her entire salary from one film to help refugees, selling war bonds, serving food to soldiers at the Hollywood Canteen before they deployed to the Pacific Theater, and then touring with the USO for the troops overseas on leave from the front, waltzing out of the audience in a custom-made military uniform, and changing behind a screen on stage, which always made men scream, before she started to sing several songs in which she hiked up her skirt to show off her legs. She also insisted on accompanying the forward troops into Germany, though she had to accept bodyguards in order to do so. By now, Dietrich's daughter was an adult, a promising young actress, and breaking out from her mother's control, which prompted fights. Rudy and his mistress survived the war too, and ended up in New York. Her sister also survived, riding out the war in Germany. Her cousin ended up a Russian prisoner of war. Her mother fled both the German and Russian armies in the final destruction of Berlin and was located months later, hiding in a damaged cabin after years of being surveyed by the Gestapo as politically suspicious.
That sounds like a near miss.
Meanwhile, now called traitor by many in bombed-down Germany, Dietrich in her mid-40s returned from the war after getting the flu, frostbite screamed at on stage by thousands of men who missed women, and a jaw infection that was treated at the end of the war. She was also very confused and felt like she had to reintegrate to America all over again like the returning soldiers. In fact, she'd say the war was the only important thing she'd done in life.
Wow, and that's saying something for her.
She also wasn't quite sure what to do with herself now, after years of following Paramount's instructions and then Army orders. She did have an affair with the airborne General James Gavin, then 39, which resulted in his wife filing for divorce and naming Marlene as the cause.
She still got it.
Whether this affair helped her clear up her own confusion, who knows, but she did return to the screen in 1947, the year she also received the Medal of Freedom and the Legion of Honor for her entertaining the troops. The next year, her daughter, in her second marriage, gave birth to a boy, John Riva, and the world immediately dubbed 47-year-old Marlene the most glamorous grandmother in the world. This did not stop Dietrich from continuing to have affairs with both men and women and traveling across the globe. She continued in films on and off, but she primarily spent her time touring as a cabaret artist from the early 1950s to the mid-70s. She visited West Germany in 1960 to mixed reviews, partly over lingering negative feelings of World War II. In fact, there was a deluge of hate mail.
Yeah, how dare she resist the Nazis?
Several venues canceled Dietrich's show, but she continued with it. Despite this, the German public was curious. After all they knew were the memories of what Nazi papers had spouted 2 decades before, as they'd been too busy digging their cities and themselves out of rubble. In the end, every German review was a love letter, and the only injury was when she slipped and broke her shoulder. Dietrich was getting old, though she refused to admit that and used tape, makeup, and lighting to keep up the image of glamour on stage. Her blasé attitude towards it with audiences couldn't slow down the march of time. She was diagnosed with cervical cancer in 1965 at the age of 64 and became increasingly dependent on alcohol and painkillers in order to get through performances. There was also the time an entire flap of skin on her left thigh ripped off in a fall and then turned black, necessitating a wheelchair in order to perform. She was eventually flown off for surgery. Marlene insisted on going back to her tour soon after, despite doctors' protests. This merry-go-round of performance and injury finally ended after breaking a thigh bone in Sydney, Australia in 1975.
My goodness, she is injury-prone.
Rudy, her husband, died the next year after having a stroke. Her last film performance occurred in the 1979 film Just a Gigolo, where she ran a brothel and sang a song, oddly reminiscent of her early films. Her autobiography came out that same year. And then Marlene withdrew to Paris, where she spent much of her time bedridden, probably as a result of these constant injuries. While she narrated the 1984 documentary about her, she refused to be filmed. That film ended with her tiredly reciting a poem from her autobiography when she thought the tapes were turned off, but you can hear at the end where she broke and just sobbed a sentence that wasn't part of the poem. I never meant to hurt anyone.
Oh, no.
Perhaps this was in part over her daughter, who would go on in 1992 to write in a biography of Dietrich about how the actress was not a good mother, to put it mildly. Naturally, Marlene hated the documentary when she saw it.
Yeah, I can imagine having problems with that portrayal of yourself.
When the Berlin Wall came down in December 1991, she was celebrated in Germany, for the first time, really. Radio stations paid tribute to her. Germany's Minister of the Interior sent her an official birthday telegram. Marlene was still alive when news came of her daughter writing a biography, though, so she threatened to sue her own child.
Oof, that does not sound like it would be a good case.
It also didn't happen in the end. Instead, Dietrich died in May 1992 at the age of 90 from kidney failure in her Parisian flat. Her coffin was draped in the French flag with medals placed on the lid. Various ambassadors attended her funeral, which was said to cram 1,500 people into the church before her body was wrapped in an American flag and shipped to Berlin and buried near the grave of her mother after a procession. The biography, though, came out after the funeral.
Wow, so a mixed legacy.
Yes, and so we come to the end of this episode. Dietrich never liked biographers, as one of them noted in the intro to their own book on her. In fact, she placed the word in quotation marks and felt they were somewhat appropriating her life, all while she worried over if they'd get the facts right. So I'd say it's safe to say that she'd be just as annoyed by us as Garbo would have been.
But, we can't not talk about her, right? I mean, she had such a cultural impact, and I like to think that we are kind of reversing some of the damage done by, the caricatures that you see of her that are just a sexy woman with German accent and nothing more. At least we're going in depth here. I did want to point out, though, speaking of sexy women with German accents, that if you've seen Blazing Saddles, the Mel Brooks movie, then Lily von Stupp is, in fact, based on Dietrich, if you didn't know. So, would highly recommend to anyone wanting to see some of the lasting cultural impact of Dietrich and her image in the character of Lily von Stupp.
I cannot say about pop culture, really. I know there's a German film from the turn of the century about her that I can never find the entire thing of online. Most of what I know comes from the old Hollywood fandom dichotomy of if you like Dietrich or if you like Garbo.
Dichotomy, you mean?
Let me have my word sayings.
Do what you want, but it's going to be recorded on the internet.
Thank you for listening. Subscribe to us on YouTube or check us out on Twitter if that site still exists. And of course, you can find us on various podcast sites to follow and rate. And remember, if people complain that your legs are distracting, build your career on that distraction.